Early medieval Japan was a time of destruction. It began with the Genpei War, the burning of Todaiji Nara, and the fires and earthquakes and famines that afflicted the capital. Then, around the middle of the century, two separate multi-year famines. By one estimation, a third of the population died. And then came the Mongol invasions of 1274 and 1281. But this was also a long century of construction and reconstruction. The Minamoto and the Hojo kept trying to rebuild Todaiji, even when skilled labor was scarce. They also sponsored the building of dozens of shrines and temples to turn Kamakura into a seat of political, cultural, and religious power. Have you played the game Ghost of Tsushima? In this video game, you are a provincial warrior leader who fights against the first Mongol invasion. You also fight against local gangs of robbers and pirates, navigate around collapsed supply chains, experience famine and disease, and scavenge the countryside for construction staples such as iron, wood, bamboo, and labor. In this game, the island of Tsushima seems to stand for the whole of Japan, and the autumn of the invasion for the whole of the early medieval period. You even run into Tomoe, the legendary warrior from the Genpei War, and you compose waka poems on topics such as loss and impermanence. Yet this is how the game depicts a woodworker. Please help me here. What is this guy doing? It's not just that he's mindlessly hacking at a stump. He's using a saw instead of an axe. This is not just insane. The reaping saw we see was only developed in the 16th century. This, by the way, is how you're actually meant to use that saw. If you use it to chop, it will break. This is not a trade secret, it's basic knowledge. It pretty much shows that among the 2,000 people or so who worked for 6 years to make this video game, there were no people with experience in woodworking, or that if there were carpenters, their voice didn't count. By contrast, portrayals of carpentry in early medieval illustrated narratives about the origins of temples and shrines were very accurate. In the title of this talk, The Poetics of Reconstruction, I refer to the structure, form, and impact of portrayals of work of construction in a context of disaster and chaos. You could also call it a grammar of reconstruction if you bear in mind the centrality of the affective dimension to this portrayal. These four engi emaki from the turn of the 14th century. From top to bottom, they narrate the origins of Taima Temple in Nara, Ishiyama Temple in Omi, Kasuga Shrine in Nara, and Kitano Shrine in the capital. I won't analyze each of these massive sets of scrolls, but read them across the grain, focusing only on the portrayals of work. I will argue that while the texts focus on patrons and oracles and sites, the illustrations reflect the collective, collaborative, affective nature of the work. The textual narratives in these four works follow a common pattern. They state the who, the why, and the what of construction. That is, they name the elite patron, the oracles or visions or disasters that prompted the building, and what they built. The texts only refer to the construction briefly and in passing, sometimes as briefly as a shrine was built. The scroll, shown at bottom, is the only that mentions carpenters. And it turns out that the illustration doesn't show the building of Kitano Shrine, but the work of reconstruction after a fire destroyed the imperial palace. And all of this because of a poem. This poem is attributed to the spirit of Sugawara no Michizane, who had died in exile after being accused of treason. The story about this poem is set almost 80 years after his death. The palace had burned 3 times, and one morning, the carpenters found the poem carved by bugs on a wooden plank. Tsukuru tomo mata mo yakinamu Sugawara ya mune no itama no awanu kagiri wa. Even if they rebuild it, it shall burn again. O grassy fields of Sugawara, for as long as there is no fix for the pain in my chest. This story appears already in works of the 12th century, first in Okagami, then in Fukurozoshi, and later in Hobutsushu. It is always attributed to the spirit of Michizane, probably because his family name appears in the third line. But none of these texts had included illustrations. The poem can actually be read in two ways. As translated here, the last two lines mean for as long as there is no fix for the pain in my chest, that is, until the court redresses Michizane's grievances, the palace will keep burning. But Mune, chest, means also ridgepole and by extension building. And Ita means pain, but also wooden boards, and Ma means gap, and in this context, Awanu can mean badly fit. So in this second reading, the last two lines can be for as long as there is no fix for the gaps in the roof boards. Michizane says that the palace, and by extension the imperial line, will not last unless the carpenters do a better job. He reminds us that as much as he was the victim of intrigue, he remained an elite aristocrat. The illustration shows the moment they find his poem carved on a board. It's tempting to do a Marxist analysis and see two classes. The aristocrats will worry about the poem's first meaning, the court is in danger, while the workers care more for the other meaning, which criticizes their work and blames them for the fires. Adding to the tension, the insects the god enlisted to convey the oracle were likely termites, a carpenter's worst enemy, and more of a threat to buildings that are gaps between roof boards. The illustration itself seems to support this reading, as elite and non-elite figures are kept separate from each other. Moreover, these two groups map onto what we know about the production of emaki as material media. The patrons, authors, and calligraphers tended to be high-ranking aristocrats. The illustrators were usually lower-ranking aristocrats, or by the turn of the 14th century, just commoners. It makes sense that while texts focus on aristocratic concerns, such as why a new shrine is needed, the images show how it was actually built and what that felt like. This is true for other scrolls as well. There are two work sites in the Taima scrolls. In this one, we see the making of a water well. The patrons of the project are represented by the one priest. The workers, by contrast, are many. We see plain laborers digging, others carrying dirt or stone slabs, and carpenters making the wooden edge for the well. Their work is supervised by the chief carpenter, the man with the measuring stick next to the priest. Interestingly, this illustration suggests that the chief carpenter is not only the link to the elite sponsor, but the person responsible for the whole project of construction, not just the carpentry. The chief carpenter, known as Torio, would have been a low-ranking aristocrat, or possibly a commoner, just like the illustrators. In the other work sites seen in the Taima, we find again the same pattern: one patron, one chief carpenter, and workers organized by skill and trade. We also see two apprentices, one observing and the other already participating in the work. The issue of child labor is, of course, relevant here, and I will be happy to address it later in the Q&A. In summary, this is a portrayal of work as a complex process involving technical specialization, scaffolded pedagogical practices, layered professional hierarchies, and so on. Of particular interest is the saw. This saw appears in most work sites seen from the early medieval period. The earliest archaeological finding at the Kusado Sengencho site is dated also to this period. So this saw represented the state of the art in woodworking at the time. The blade found at Kusado Sengencho is highly deteriorated, but a group of experimental archaeologists reconstructed a series of blades for testing and was able to determine the original thickness and tooth configuration. They figured out that the blade has two separate functions. The longest section is for cross-cutting and the tip is for curved cuts. Using their blueprints, I built my own replicas. My own testing showed that this blade can only cut efficiently on the pull stroke. If you try to use it on the push, it will break. Previous saws had cut on the push. A saw that cuts on the pull is harder to make for the blacksmith, but very useful to the carpenter. This saw was developed in Japan in the 13th century and was never common in Korea or China. So the illustrators must have witnessed one of these saws in action. Yet we find more than technological accuracy in these scrolls. In this scene from a different scroll, we see a woman wearing an apron serving food to a group of men. In the front row, one man is chatting, another eating, a third appears to be asking for seconds, and the last discards his food with a look of disgust. Below them, three young apprentices carry bundles of bark. The kids below them are playing next to a toolbox, and a man carries a broadleaf saw in his mouth. There are no indications of just how dangerous or exhausting carpentry work can be. A sense of quiet intimacy prevails, heightened by the absence of patrons at the site. This other worksite scene takes the portrayal of affect even further. The group surrounding the bell includes courtiers, priests, laborers, such as the man with a hoe, and carpenters, just as the man with a square on his hip. Their enthusiasm is apparent. Open mouths, raised arms, turned heads, and forward-leaning bodies, suggesting a unity of affect across class divides. This sense of excitement pervades the whole scene. Here, a crew is pulling a heavy timber, guided by the shouts of a foreman with a fan. A carpenter at far left points his saw upwards in excitement. And here, a logger, having put down his axe for a moment, appears lost in a daydream. Notice that he is using an axe, unlike the logger in the video game. By the way, the trees look like a pine and a cedar. Both are staple construction materials, so here we see not just the clearing of the grounds, but the harvesting of timber. It is hard to get a sense of the whole illustration. It's too long and rather chaotic. But it is carefully structured to portray three crucial steps in the construction of a temple. The width of its section is not arbitrary. I discovered this when I made a physical facsimile of the scrolls. It turns out that your shoulder span is a good rule of thumb to parse the images in all of these scrolls. If you look at the images on the screen of your computer, you are not likely to notice it. But handling the object makes it immediately apparent. Up to now, I showed you idealized depictions of social harmony, unity of purpose, and community of affect. But let's go back to the first scroll we saw, and in particular to this section. Near the bottom of the page, three children are fighting. Top right, there is a man kicking a child. Is this a suggestion that physical violence is part of the life of craftspeople? Maybe. But this is also an allusion to another scroll, The Tale of Ban Dainagon. In that other work, after two boys engage in a fight, the father of one severely beats the other boy. That boy's father, in retaliation, accuses Ban Dainagon, the boss of the first man, of arson, and Ban Dainagon is exiled. So, the false accusation, the arson, and the exile all resonate with Michizane's own tragedy. Moreover, the two stories partially overlap in time to suggest it was an era of palace intrigue and misgovernment. A reader sympathetic to the carpenters could extend this parallel to argue that Michizane's poem was similarly slanderous and unfair to them. So before I recap my argument, let me mention a couple of things I left out of this talk and would be happy to discuss in the Q&A. First, there is a precedent for technical depictions in Southern Song paintings, but no portrayals of building or carpentry. Second, the accuracy of these portrayals would not last. Later depictions of woodworking are superficial and vague and full of mistakes. Third, there are two more works with worksite scenes from the early medieval period I didn't show. But they're in the genre of Eden, or illustrated biographies. One shows temple carpenters making a boat. The other, civil engineers assembling todaiji. So this is what I argued today. The earliest portrayals of building emerged during a period of destruction, but also construction and reconstruction. Work is depicted as a technological, but also social and affective process. There are also internal hierarchies, with carpenters at the top of the pyramid. I also established an isomorphism between the collaborative building of shrines and temples and the collaborative production of illustrated scrolls. My analytic approach is similarly collaborative, as it engages scholarship and scholars from half a dozen different disciplines, from experimental archaeology to historical epidemiology. The worksite scenes emerge from this analysis as complex artifacts in which the joy of work and of social life more generally appears side by side with the tensions, the challenges, and the violence of a century of loss and of attempts at building stronger resilience. Thank you very much.